was crying, putting on a smile and I was keeping it fake. But there's no imitating what I found in your grace. All the things I left behind, a shadow, now I've seen the light.
Let's go.
In my head, in my soul, my heart, my all, I know that I know. Never have I ever found a love so good, so good. Never am I ever getting over living with you. Nothing will change it. All I can say is never have I ever found a love so good, so good. I got a million reasons why I can't be the same. Never turning my gaze. Forever God, it's you and I. Forever till the end of time. Yeah, yeah, yeah. In my head, my
Are y'all ready to
soul,
jump? Come on.
my heart,
Come on, let's get ready.
my all. I know
Let's go.
that I know. Never have I ever found a love so good, so good. Never am I ever getting over living with you. Nothing will change it. All I can say is never have I ever found a love so good, so good. Your love is patient, love is kind. Your love is never hard to find. Forever I am yours, you're mine. Alright. Never have I ever found a love so good, so good. Never am I ever getting over living with you. Nothing will change it. All I can say is never have I ever found a love so good, so good. No, never have I ever known. No, never have I ever known. No, never have I ever known. No, never have I ever known.
Make some noise. All right. Before we start this next song, are y'all really ready to worship, or y'all just want to chill out? Y'all want to chill out? Do y'all know every little thing? Y'all, yes? No? Yeah? Do y'all want to sing every little thing? No? Yes? No? All right, let's sing every little thing. Let's hit it. 2, 3.
Faith awaits within the future. My dreams are small compared to yours.
Yeah.
Why should I worry about tomorrow? I know that all I gotta do is trust you, Lord. Every little thing's gonna be alright. Every little thing's gonna be just fine. Whether I can see it now
we gather here in your name, Lord, to praise you. Lord, as we go into service, remind us, is this a stage or is this an altar? Why are we here, God? Refocus our hearts and our minds so we're your people all together coming here for your glory alone, God. You can take away the lights, you can take away the music, God. All that matters is you and us, God. Make this personal tonight. Let something Jess says lead this room so we leave changed people, God. And it's in your name we pray these things. Amen.
All right. So, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we are on week 7 of our In the Beginning series, where we have been working our way through from Genesis to Esther, and we've got basically 4 weeks to go, 7, 8, 9, 10. So, how many of you, is anybody still doing it? Anybody still at least making a good faith effort some days to do it? A few of you, just a few of you. Okay, that's okay. Is it harder than you thought it was gonna be? Those of you that tried it and you fell off the wagon, harder than you thought it was gonna be? Yeah, that's okay. It's been harder than I thought it would be. I think it's been harder than all of us thought it would be. So no guilt in that. I wanna say this, if you say you went on vacation and you're back now, or you had summer school and you're done with that now, or whatever, you had something and that caused you to miss a bunch, you could start again, right? There's no reason. In fact, you could start now this week with where we are, and it's mostly narrative. We're through a lot of the laws and a lot of the begats and all of that, the genealogy stuff. So it's a lot more narrative now, on through the rest. So you might find it a little more accessible. So even if you were I don't want to do this, and you had no interest before, maybe you want to jump in now with just a few weeks left. I think it would still be meaningful for you. So as I mentioned, the gummy bears are all headless because last week we read about how David beheaded Goliath after he killed him. So enjoy your headless gummy bears. And yeah, there you go. So this week, where are we? We finished 1 Samuel, or we are finishing, I think tomorrow, we finish 1 Samuel and start 2 Samuel. And so at the end of 1 Samuel, we come to basically Saul is dead. And in case you are not 100% sure where we are in the story before we kick into what we're going to study tonight, I wanted to just catch you up. So this is about a 5-minute video that's going to catch you up on everywhere that we have been, particularly on the book of 1 Samuel. So watch this.
The books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. They're 2 separate books in our modern Bibles, but that division is due simply to scroll length. It was originally written as one coherent story. We're just going to cover the book of 1 Samuel in this video. So after Israel was rescued from slavery in Egypt, they made a covenant with God at Mount Sinai and eventually came into the Promised Land. And there, Israel was supposed to be faithful to God and obey the covenant commands. Before the book of Samuel, Judges showed how Israel failed at that task big time. It was a period of moral chaos, and it showed Israel's need for wise, faithful leaders. The book of Samuel provides an answer to that need. The book of Samuel's story focuses on 3 main characters: the prophet Samuel, where the book gets its name, and then King Saul, and after that, King David. And all 3 of them transitioned Israel from a group of tribes ruled by judges into a unified kingdom ruled by King David in Jerusalem. And the book of Samuel has a fascinating design that weaves the story of these 3 characters together in 4 main parts. Samuel, he's the key leader and prophet in the first section of the book, but then he also plays a key role in the next section, which is Saul's story, and it's told in 2 movements: Saul's rise to power and then his failures, And the second part is about his downfall and his tragic death. And then the drama of Saul's demise is matched by David's exciting rise to power. And then David's story is told in two movements. First, he rides the wave of his success, followed by his own tragic failure and the slow self-destruction of his family and then his kingdom. The book concludes with an epilogue that reflects back over the whole story. So let's dive in and see how this all unfolds. Part 1 picks up from the chaos of the book of Judges, and we're introduced to a touching story about a woman named Hannah. And she's grieved because she has never been able to have children. And by God's grace, she finally has a son named Samuel. And in joy, she sings this amazing poem in chapter 2. And the poem is all about how God opposes the proud and exalts the humble, about how despite tragedies and human evil, God is working out his purposes in history. And also it's about how God will one day raise up an anointed king for his people. Now, Hannah's poem has been placed here at the beginning of the book to introduce these key themes that we're going to see throughout the whole story, like the next one. Samuel grows up and becomes a great prophet and leader for the people of Israel, at the same time that the Philistines rise to power as Israel's arch nemesis. And in this crucial battle, the Israelites get arrogant, and instead of praying and asking God for help, they trot out the Ark of the Covenant as this kind of magic trophy that will automatically grant them victory in battle. And so because of their arrogant presumption, God allows Israel to lose the battle and the ark is stolen. So the Philistines, they take the ark and they place it in the temple of their god, Dagon. And then the God of Israel defeats the Philistines and the god Dagon without an army by sending plagues on the people. And then the Philistines don't want the ark anymore, obviously, and they send it back to Israel. And the point of this little story seems to be this: God is not Israel's trophy, and he opposes pride among the Philistines, but also among his own people. And so Israel needs to remain humble and obedient if they want to experience God's covenant blessing, which opens up into the next large section. The Israelites come to Samuel and they say, hey, we want a king like all the other nations have. Go find one for us. And so Samuel, he's kind of ticked off and he goes to consult with God. And God says, yes, their motives are all wrong, but if a king is what they want, give them one. And so we're introduced to the figure of Saul. Now, Saul is a tragic figure because he begins full of promise. He's tall, he's good looking, he's a perfect candidate for a king. But he has deep character flaws. He's dishonest, he lacks integrity, and he seems incapable of acknowledging his own mistakes. And so these flaws become his downfall. He wins some battles at the beginning, but his flaws run so deep, he eventually disqualifies himself by blatantly disobeying God's commands. And so the aging Samuel confronts Saul and Israel. He had warned the people that they would only benefit from a king who's humble and faithful to God. Otherwise, the kings of Israel will bring ruin. So he informs Saul that God is going to raise up a new king to replace him. And so Saul's downfall begins, as God at the same time is working behind the scenes to raise up that new king. It's an insignificant shepherd boy named David. He's the least likely candidate to be king, but the famous story of David and Goliath shows that God's choice of David is not based on his family status, but simply on his radical and humble trust in the God of Israel. And so this story embodies all of the themes of Hannah's poem. Proud Saul and Goliath are brought low, while humble David is exalted. From here, we watch Saul slowly descend into madness, while David rises to power. So David starts working for Saul as a general, and he's winning all of the battles, and he's also winning all of the fame. And so Saul gets jealous, and he starts chasing David around, hunting him, trying to kill him. David's done nothing wrong, and so David simply runs and waits in the wilderness. And here we see David's true character. He has multiple opportunities to kill Saul, but he doesn't. He simply trusts that despite Saul's evil, God will raise up a king for his people. What's interesting, too, is that many of the poems of David that you find in the book of Psalms are linked to this very period of his life, and they all express the same attitude of trust. And so this section of the book ends with Saul coming to a grisly death after losing a battle with the Philistines. 1 Samuel tells some of the most intricate, well-told stories you find anywhere in the Bible. And the characters Saul and David, they're portrayed very realistically. And the author's putting them forward as character studies so that you can find yourself in them. So in Saul's story, we see a warning. It's crucial that we reflect on our own character flaws and how they harm us and other people. And with God's help, we need to humble ourselves and deal with our dark side so that Saul's story doesn't become ours. David, on the other hand, is presented as an example of patience and trust in God's timing in our lives. And so he's running in the wilderness, being chased by Saul. David had every reason to think that God had abandoned him, but that's not what he thinks. And so David's story encourages us to trust that despite human evil, God is working out his purposes to oppose the proud and to exalt the humble. And that's what 1 Samuel is all about.
All right. There is a similar video for 2 Samuel. If you are curious and just would like to get an overview of it before you read it, then you can look it up at thebibleproject.com and watch a similar one with drawings if you found that helpful. I do sometimes. So Saul is dead. The first king is dead, and now David is laying claim to the throne. And so here's something important for you to know. It's not just like automatic. Even though in the story that we have read in 1 Samuel, Samuel has clearly anointed David as the next king of Israel, the only people that know that are like Samuel and David and his brothers and his dad and maybe some other people where like that news has spread. But as far as like the broader nation of Israel, they have no reason to think that David is going to be the next king, because think about every monarchy that you are aware of. When the king dies, who becomes the next king? The prince, right? Like whoever the crown prince, like who's going to be king after Queen Elizabeth dies? Anybody? Okay. His name is Prince Charles. Thank you. His name is Prince Charles. He's like 80, and he's going to be the king when his mom dies, because that's the way that it always works. And then when Charles dies, then Prince William, his oldest son, will be the next king, and so on and so forth. And so that's the way it works usually. And David is not Saul's son, so there's no real reason, as far as like the way that monarchies usually work, that David would become the king. So there's all this like political maneuvering. And one of the things that happens that I want to just call your attention to, because I think it's important as we read through the Bible to call attention sometimes to the stories of women who kind of make important appearances, even if they're not like the main character, is for you to notice the character of Michal. And Michal is Saul's daughter. And so at one point, David, because remember that we're talking about like 1150 BC, women were still the property of their fathers, and then eventually became the property of their husbands. They didn't really have any agency of their own, and so David wins Michal's hand in marriage when he wins some big military victory, and Saul gives him his daughter as like his reward for defeating this army. And so, and at the time, it appears that Michal and David have a loving relationship, that they really like each other, that they have what we would consider to be like a fairly normal marriage, and that they have like affection for one another. But then, as you saw in the video, Saul starts to like hate David, starts to hunt him. He doesn't want him around anymore. And so even though he had given his daughter to David in marriage, when David runs away and Saul is hunting him, then Saul gives Michal to a different dude to marry him instead. So Michal is now technically the wife of two different men because her dad gave her hand in marriage twice. So, and I can't remember what the new guy's name is, but she and him go and they like live together and are married. So then, when Saul dies, David now is making several different political maneuverings in order to lay claim to this throne that he believed that God has given him. God's anointed him, but there's still some like political maneuvering that has to happen. And one of the things that he does is he calls for Michal to be brought back to him, because if you think about it, I'm sure they had like I'm sure the story about them having a loving relationship was probably true, but also he is the son-in-law to the king, right? Which is a step closer in like legitimacy than just being this random shepherd boy servant of the king, right? So by having Michal as his wife, that makes him the son-in-law to the daughter of the king, and so that helps him with his claim to legitimacy to the throne. So he calls Michal to come and be his wife again. The problem is that it appears that at least the husband of Michal's new husband at least, has affection for her. How she feels about him, we don't know. She does not have a voice in this part of the story, so we don't know how she feels about him. But her husband, she is like taken away from her husband, and the story tells us that her husband is like chasing after her until the guy who works for David, who took her, is like, dude, go home, this is over. And so he finally gives up. And so she's taken from his house and brought back to David to be David's wife. And I think it's fair to say at this point she has mixed feelings about who's, like if I were her, I would probably be like a little annoyed that I didn't have any agency over my own life. Like people keep giving me in marriage to different, like my husband keeps changing. Like that would be frustrating for me as a person. I don't know, maybe you would be good with it, but I would have a hard time with that. So that's what happens. So put a pin in that about Michal. And then there's a bunch of other things that happen. David decides that he wants to unite all the tribes of Israel. So you kind of saw a hint of it there in the video, but the tribes of Israel are all like kind of scattered. They're like semi-autonomous different groups, and David is going to bring them all under what's called a unified kingdom. And so Saul was not able to do that, but David brings all of the 12 tribes of Israel into a unified kingdom. And one of the ways that he does that is by moving the capital city of Israel from a place called Hebron, which was kind of further into the south of the kingdom, to a more central location so that everybody in the entire country would be able to get to it a little bit more easily. And so he moves Jerusalem, he makes that the capital city, and a couple of other like political things that he does in order to establish his rule over the entire unified kingdom. So he's made Jerusalem the capital. He is now married again to the former king's daughter. And so he's legitimized his claim to the throne geographically, but now he needs to legitimize it religiously. So he's made Jerusalem the capital in like a political way, in a geographical way, but now he wants to make it the capital of Israel in a religious way. So he decides he's going to move the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Did you guys catch the part about the Ark of the Covenant in the video that we just watched? It talked about how at one point the Israelites, without consulting God, they go to battle against the Philistines, and they take the Ark of the Covenant with them, and they kind of use it like a trophy, almost like it's magic. Like if they take the Ark of the Covenant, it's like magic, and they'll automatically win just because they have it. And God is like, no, it doesn't quite work that way. Thanks, but no thanks. And so they get defeated, and the Philistines steal the Ark of the Covenant, but God is like, no, I don't belong to you either, sorry. And so they eventually give it back to him. So the Ark of the Covenant is a big deal. It's like a religious, we don't have anything like the Ark of the Covenant that we could like. Did you guys ever see Raiders of the Lost Ark? Yeah? Okay, so you kind of think about that movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Did you guys see the one, is Raiders of the Lost Ark the one where they have the chalice and they like drink from the special chalice? Is that the one, is that the Indiana Jones one that I'm thinking of, or is that a different one?
That's the second one.
Some other one? Okay. So Raiders of the Lost Ark, the Ark that we're talking about is the Ark of the Covenant in Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so it has this it's like got power, but it only has power because God gives it power, right? Like the power is God, but there's a lot of like special things about the ark that make it like a physical manifestation of God's power, something that we can physically look at and see that sort of represents God's power. And so it doesn't have magic, but there is power in it because God, kind of chooses to use God's power through it. So, I'm sure that doesn't hardly make any sense, but basically, David decides that in order to make Jerusalem the religious capital of Israel as well, he needs the Ark of the Covenant to be in Jerusalem. So he begins to make that trip. And so he starts to make the trip with the Ark of the Covenant, and the deal is that you're not supposed to touch the Ark of the Covenant. And so there's these long poles that stretch across it, and the priests carry the poles, not the Ark itself. And so they start to carry the Ark of the Covenant, and one of them, I think they carried it on some oxen. I think that's what they were using, was oxen. I'm trying to remember from the story because this isn't technically the part we're looking at, so I don't have it right here in front of me. But they have some oxen, and one of the oxen trips, and this dude reaches out to touch the ark to make it not fall, and he's dead immediately. Like lightning strikes him and he falls down dead. Because you're not supposed to touch the ark. The only person who is supposed to touch the ark at any time ever is the high priest on one day of the year when the high priest is making atonement for the sins of the entire nation. The rest of the time, nobody touches the Ark of the Covenant, okay? So you're only supposed to use you're supposed to use these poles to carry it, and this one guy touches it, and he's immediately struck down dead. And so David is like, oh, okay, this is like a whole different thing than I thought it was gonna be. So he's like, I think maybe the ark can stay here for a while. And so he leaves it with the Obed-Edom people. And this is like this random tribe. And he leaves it there in their household with this tribe. And is like, we're just going to leave this here because I'm kind of freaked out by how powerful it is. Like that dude dying on the spot scares me. And so he leaves the ark there. But a couple of years go by, we're not entirely sure how long. A little bit of time goes by, and Edom, the people who have the Ark of the Covenant, their household thrives. Like every sheep is having lots of babies, and like all of the wheat is growing, or whatever crops they were growing. Like there's so much, like they just have this abundance of stuff. They're just flourishing. There's so, just like abundance is happening for their entire tribe. And so David is like, I want me some of that. And so he says, okay, let's go get it, and let's bring it back to Jerusalem after all. And so, this is the part that we're going to read together in 2 Samuel chapter 6. And yes, so I have a different translation in my notes accidentally. So I'm going to have you throw it up on the screen so I can read the same thing that you guys are reading. All right, then King David was told, the Lord has blessed Obed-Edom's household and everything he has because of the ark of God. So David went there and brought the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with a great celebration. The city of David is Jerusalem. After the men who were carrying the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, David sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf, okay? 6 steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Stop. Sacrificing a bull and a fattened calf. Every 6 steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Stop. Make a sacrifice. Okay? And then we also see David danced before the Lord with all his might, wearing a priestly garment. That is called, let me look, that's one of the reasons I have my other notes here. David was girded with a linen ephod. Do you guys know what that means? That means he was buck naked, except for this one garment that he had tied around his waist. Okay? So he's the king of Israel. He's dancing naked with this garment tied around his waist, and he's dancing with all his might before all of the people, before the Ark of the Covenant, as they march it from Evpod-Odom or whatever to Jerusalem. Okay, so it's a sight. It's a sight. Okay, so where are we? Okay. So David and all the people of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouts of joy and the blowing of ram's horns. So this isn't just the priests and David. There's like it's like a parade from this town, from where these tribes are, from where the Ark of the Covenant had been to Jerusalem. It's like a parade. And so they're blowing horns, they're shouting with joy. David's up front, dancing naked. And then every 6 steps he stops, sacrifices the ram and the fattened calf, and then they take 6 more steps. It takes forever to get to Jerusalem, right? Like there's just this constant stop, go with all of this, and then keep going to the next. But as the ark of the Lord entered the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked down from her window, and when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she was filled with contempt for him. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the special tent David had prepared for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and peace offerings to the Lord. When he had blessed the people in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, then he gave to every Israelite man and woman in the crowd a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins. Then all the people returned to their homes. Okay, so stop right there for just a second. So the celebration, the parade, is marked with just abundance, right? With an abundance of sacrifices, an abundance of worship, an abundance of caution around the power of the ark. It's just absolute abundance. The way that David is treating this movement of the ark into Jerusalem, I can't really fathom a way that you could possibly make it more like special, more clearly set apart from anything else that's happening. It's like the definition of worshiping with all you've got, right? And it's pretty inspiring, apparently, unless you're Michal, who is filled with contempt about what David is doing when she sees him enter like this. So yeah, it's like the ultimate church service. There's worship. They're singing songs of praise, they're sacrificing, they're doing all of these things that would be a part of their normal worship environment. There's a blessing over the people, so there's a little bit, David preaches a little bit of a sermon once they finally get into Jerusalem. There's food, so that we like food at church, right? So it's a party because the ark is now in the capital city, and so Israel has a home. Remember that these are people who wandered in the wilderness for 40 years without a home. Israel now has a home and a king, and now the ark, now God also has a home here in Israel, in Jerusalem. It's a big moment for them as a people. So Israel has a home and God has a place in it. Verse 20. When David returned home to bless his own family, remember, because he's blessed everybody else while they were when they brought the ark into the city, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet him. She said in disgust, "How distinguished the king of Israel looked today, shamelessly exposing himself to the servant girls like any vulgar person might do." David retorted to Michal, "I was dancing before the Lord, who chose me above your father and all his family. He appointed me as the leader of Israel, the people of the Lord, so I celebrate before the Lord. Yes, and I am willing to look even more foolish than this, even to be humiliated in my own eyes. But those servant girls you mentioned will indeed think I am distinguished." So Michal, the daughter of Saul, remained childless throughout her entire life. There's an old worship song that we sang when I was in high school that said, put these words in David's mouth, "And I'll become even more undignified than this." Some will say it's foolishness. "I'll become even more undignified than this, leave my pride by the side." That I'll become even more undignified than what you have already witnessed, than the 6 steps and then the sacrifice, than me dancing naked before my entire country. I will become even more undignified than even that. I will leave my pride aside. I will do whatever it takes to worship my God, whatever it is that you have to, or anybody else has to say about it. David tells us that whatever Michal thinks, he will worship God as he's been called to worship, and that is that. He will put his hands up or he will put his hands down. He will stand if he wants to, or he will sit if he wants to. He will kneel or jump or dance. He will do whatever he needs to do, whatever he's been called to do in that moment, to worship God with total abandon, with his whole heart, in whatever way he has to, in order to communicate what is in his heart to the God who has created him and who has brought him to this point. And that is what we are called to do. Are you called to dance naked before the Lord? Probably not, at least not tonight, I would suggest, maybe. But you have been created for and called to worship. God is jealous for and demands your worship, your most heartfelt expression of gratitude for who God is and for what God has done for you. And that can and does happen in this room on Sunday nights all the time, and in rooms like it all across the globe throughout the different generations. And it also happens in our cars. When we're driving, it happens in our kitchens. While we cook, it happens in our bedrooms when we're playing around on a guitar, or in a million other ways. And not just through music. We worship God anytime we express our love for God, our confession of who God is, our gratitude for what God has done for us, which means we can also worship when we are laughing with friends, or when we are serving the poor or the marginalized. It means that we can work at our jobs or do homework for school and worship at the same time, because while we are hiking or writing or leading or painting or teaching, if we are living our lives, if we are breathing in and breathing out in such a way that we are expressing to God who God is, who we confess God to be, and our gratitude for what God has done, then we are living from a place of worship. Then we are worshiping. What matters is the posture of your heart, that you are humble before God as you praise God's name and exalt God's goodness. And so what I want to challenge you on today is this idea that David danced with all his might, that he worshiped with total abandon, that he held nothing back in the way that he worshiped. He was vulnerable before the people. He allowed a part of himself, of who he was, to be seen that is not normally seen. And I'm not just talking about his nakedness. I'm talking about the way in which he loved God, was seen, was vulnerable, was exposed before his country. He held nothing back in worship. He allowed himself to be a little bit humiliated so that nothing would stand between him and his worship of the Lord. When was the last time that you worshiped with total abandon? What does that look like for you? Much like we do here in the hangar, I grew up in a youth group that takes worship very seriously. And one thing that I had to learn in high school, and then especially in college, is that what it means for me to worship God with my whole heart looks very different than what it looks like for someone else to worship God with their whole heart. It doesn't mean the same thing for all people. And I remember one time I was in our youth room. I think I was home from college. And we didn't have like a college ministry at my church, just the way that it was set up. Our college students typically, it doesn't matter, you don't care. But I was home from college, and I was in the youth room, and I was just in the very back. I was sitting in the very back of the room in a chair, and that was pretty weird for me. I was definitely like a down front kind of girl, like many of you are. But I was sitting against the very back wall of the youth room, and I remember that I was sitting in a chair, but I had my feet kind of tucked up as close as I could, and then I just had my arms out like this, and my eyes closed, and I was just singing. I was just worshiping just like this. And this guy who was a volunteer, I think he was out of college. He was like an adult volunteer. He was like the Harry Marks of our youth group, okay? For those of you who've been around, you know who Harry is. That makes sense to you. And so he comes around, and I'm sitting there like this, worshiping, and he's coming around saying hi to people, and he goes, "Jess!" And he slaps both of my hands really hard, and I'm like, "Oh!" And he's like, "Oh, sorry." I just totally, and I was like, "It's okay." And he like totally interrupted like my whole like vibe that I had going on right then, right? And I remember at the time, like it was abnormal in our youth group to see somebody worshiping in a posture other than standing, clapping, maybe a hand in the air, maybe dancing around a little bit, maybe jumping a little bit. It was abnormal to see somebody worshiping in any other way, so he didn't recognize it when he saw it. And it wasn't his intent to disrupt me, but because I wasn't jumping around, he missed that I was worshiping. And I think sometimes we maybe do that intentionally or unintentionally. I remember I was having this pretty intense moment, and it kind of got interrupted. So whether you are a jump around person or a kneeling person or a sit quiet and reflect person, we have to remember to respect the ways that other people choose to worship too. That it doesn't and it shouldn't always look the same. And if you have had a really hard time letting everything kind of clear out of the way lately so that you can worship with your whole heart, if for some reason something has just been making it harder for you lately, or maybe you've never had a time when you were really able to just worship with abandon, maybe that's just never happened for you, or you've just been in a rut of some sort lately, then let me just offer you one small piece of advice. Maybe try a new posture. If you usually stand and clap, try raising your arms in the air. If you usually sit, maybe try standing. If you usually raise your arms, maybe try physically getting down on the ground and kneeling before God. Maybe changing your posture of your physical body might help for the posture of your heart to be changed a little bit as well. Just change your posture a little bit and see if that bit of difference doesn't help you focus on who and why we are doing all of this in the first place. And then a second thing that I want you to hear tonight is that we worship God faithfully as we've been called to worship, even when there are haters. Because there will be McCalls who try to get you to second guess who God has created you to be in worship and in response to God's goodness. There will be people who don't take your calling seriously, who think that your way of worshiping doesn't look like real worship, whatever that even is, who challenge the validity of the ways that you have found communion with and connection to God in the ways that you worship. Ignore them. Ignore them. Give as much of your time and attention to them as David gives to Michal, which is basically none. The only one who can judge the validity of your worship, how and when and where and why and all of that, is God. God's the only one who knows the posture of your heart, who knows how and why you are doing what you're doing when you worship the Lord. So God is the only one who can make that judgment, and other people don't get to do that. I have a really good friend who I deeply respect, and whose theological questions and biblical scholarship I take very seriously. He's brilliant, and he asks really good questions about the Bible. He's a pastor at a church out in Manassas, and we went to seminary together, so I've known him for 10 years. And we have regularly gotten coffee or gotten lunch and sat and had conversations about the way we do church, the church questions. And I really respect him, but he comes from a very different tradition than I do. He comes from a different style of worship and style of church than we do. And so even though we think very similarly on a lot of theological questions, on the way that we read the Bible would be similar, there's lots of ways in which, like, the Venn diagram of the way Drew thinks and the way that I think are very similar. But there's one way in which we are very different, and that is the way that we worship God. And he has, at times, kind of asked me, not in like a judgmental way, he would never be like that, but in a just curious way, like, how is it that you think the way that you think, and you kind of study the way that you study, and yet you find yourself worshiping in that style? Like he would say, like, I'm like a serious person, and yet maybe the way he was equating the way that I worship as being maybe not so serious for the way that I like think. And he didn't mean to make that like equivalency, right? But that's totally what he was saying. And I'm not saying that he didn't have any valid points. He's a thinker. He wouldn't have asked the question if he didn't have a reason to ask it. But at the end of the day, all I could say to him, and all I could ever hope for any of you, is that this way that I worship, that's where God has met me. I have experienced God in this room, right here, in the old room, back in the back of the building, in the sanctuary next door, in my own youth group growing up, the way that I have historically throughout the course of my life experienced God, the way that God has sometimes spoken to my heart, the way that God has changed me, has given me new ways to look at things that I have been worried about or pondering, the way that God has altered my faith, has healed parts of my heart, has been through this way that we worship here. This is where I meet with God. This is how God works on my heart, and occasionally how God speaks to me. This is the way that I worship with abandon. It always has been. I don't know if it always will be. Maybe someday I'll be old and I won't worship like this anymore. I don't know. But for now, this is how I tell God how good God is and how grateful I am for God's work in my life. And so maybe that's true for you too. So we're going to end our service today with an opportunity for you to worship with abandon, to maybe try something different, to become a little bit undignified, a little bit foolish. Maybe you already do that every week. Maybe when we gathered and sang and worshiped God a little bit ago, you already were doing that with your life. Maybe that's fine. That's awesome. I'm so glad. Maybe this is your opportunity to do something new, to try something that you've never tried before, to be a little bit vulnerable before your community, to try a new posture, to sing a little bit louder, to just express to God who God is in a way that is more unique to you, to not do what everybody else is doing or to do what everybody else is doing, but to do it for maybe a different reason. So we sang this song once already at the beginning of the service, but we're going to do it again. Ryan and the band are going to come out, and we're going to do it again. And I just want to challenge you to worship with abandon the God who made you, the God who loves you, the God who has been so good to you, to tell God who God is to you, to say thank you, to offer God your praise, your adoration, your worship. Let's stand and sing together.
Dreams are small compared to yours. Why should I worry
again for the gift you give us, that is worship. There's no reason for you to allow us to connect with you the way that we do, Lord, but we're so thankful. As we go about our week, Lord, let us be reminded that we're put on this earth for your glory, God. And whether it's through talking through people about the gospel or just singing worship songs in our car, Lord, let it all be for your glory. And we pray these things in your name.